Good afternoon, folks. This is Gordon Dixon with the Associated General Contractors of Virginia, and we are holding our annual 2020 General Assembly look back. We'll be starting here in just a moment. We'll give some folks some time to log in here and see that their participants are rolling up. So give us here another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get rolling. So happy noon to you all. This is Gordon Dixon, CEO for the Associated General Contractors of Virginia with our 2020 General Assembly look back analysis. What happened and how did we fare? For those of you all who are just joining us, this video webinar was going to be recorded, and we'll be able to share this with all of our members on our members only section of our website. In addition to this, AGC America has several other webinars being held this week at 2 p.m. So we appreciate you agreeing to this changed time and format. This afternoon, we have our AGCVA Lobbyist, Preston Bryant, who is with McGuire Consulting. So he'll be going through the panel here in just a second. I appreciate everyone that's been helping us out this past session. Our legislative committee has representatives from contracting community, associates community, representatives from every district who really weighed in very heavily on what we have going on. And so I appreciate that. We're being told we got a couple folks that aren't getting on just yet, so give it just a minute here. I've been asked to hold off just another second or so, so please bear with me. I know a lot of folks are learning the ins and outs of Zoom, and it seems like we're on these meetings all the time now. So we're all going to get technologically more proficient going forward on this, I think. So looks like we got a bunch more folks who've just kind of logged in. So let's go ahead and get rolling. Once again, it's Gordon Dixon, Associated General Contractors CEO with Preston Bryant with McGuire Consulting. Real quick before I turn it over to Preston, as you all know, this has been an incredibly tough session for the business community. There's been a really big political and, quite frankly, I think philosophical shift within the legislature this year, and they have everyone's business moving forward. We're going to talk a lot about those issues. Today, we're going to talk about some broader issues and then drill down as we get more specific into more construction-related issues. The legislative committee has about 25 representatives on that from various different sizes of companies and associate members, attorneys, bonding firms, and associate supplier folks on there to kind of help us provide some perspective. So a lot of the input that we came in this year, they were able to help us. As the issues came in, and Preston's probably going to touch base on this a little bit, there were not just a number of construction-related issues, there were a lot of issues that were going on. And so we had to quickly triage which issues that we were able to address and which ones we thought we had an impact on going forward. So a lot of these issues are going to be interesting to kind of see where they end up with at this point. Without further ado, Preston, I'm going to turn it over to you and go forward from there.
Thank you, Gordon, very much. My name is Preston Bryant with McGuire Consulting, and I am one of three here who worked with Gordon and your legislative committee this session. My colleagues, Chris Nolan, an attorney, and Margaret Rockwell, also an attorney, joined me, and collectively we put our shoulder to the issues with Gordon this session. This is the second year, the second General Assembly session that we have been working with you, and we enjoy it immensely. Next slide, Gordon. Also, if you have any trouble hearing me, please email Gordon or otherwise communicate with Gordon and he can let me know. I do not have access to that, but he does. So this is just a word cloud of a lot of the issues, and we'll be walking through each of these to some extent, and then getting into your issues. But these are the big issues that happened this session. Next slide, Gordon. So this is what we'll cover today. We'll do a general overview of the legislature. We'll talk about the politics, and Gordon alluded to a lot of political and philosophical changes this session. We'll do kind of a back out and look at the big issues, which I just showed you in that word cloud. The state budget drives everything, so I think it's important that you get a little bit of a flavor of the budget, and then we will get into your interests specifically and then look ahead. Next slide. So each year, the General Assembly operates on a kind of a 2-year basis. The even-numbered years, like 2020, is the long session, which is 60 days, and the odd-numbered years of the so-called short session at 45 or 46 days. This year, we actually ran over a couple of days, but they did get their work done. The legislature comes back April 22nd. And the governor, that's when all the bills that were passed are currently sitting on the governor's desk. He has until April 11 at midnight on April 11th to either sign, amend, or veto bills, including the budget. And for those amendments or vetoes, the legislature will come back into session on April 22 to consider either accepting or rejecting the governor's amendments or accepting or overriding any vetoes that he may have done. So that's to be determined. Next slide. So this was a big year. You can see just the number of bills that were introduced pushed 4,000. And that's about 800 more bills than were last year, bills and resolutions. But we want to focus on just really the bills. There are a few resolutions here and there, but it's basically the bills or the legislation that we focused on. So again, between the House and the Senate, there were about 2,700, 2,800 bills introduced. That's what Gordon and Chris and Margaret and I worked on to cull out and distill into those that might, in some fashion, major or minor, have an impact on the construction industry and your business. Of those, the House passed 748, and the Senate passed 543, and so there's an amalgamation of those bills out there now, and the governor is considering them. Next slide. We've talked before about this being a political change. Both chambers flipped in this year's November 2019 elections. The House flipped dramatically. Last year, it was 51 Republicans to 49 Democrats, so basically it was parity. Now it's 55 Democrats to 45 Republicans. That 10-seat majority in the House is huge. And that is what, in no small part, has driven the political and philosophical changes. The Senate changed less dramatically. It was 21-19 Republicans over Democrats last year, and it's 21-19 Democrats over Republicans this year. The real meat of the story in terms of how bills get passed, arguably some not so great bills that get passed, is you look at the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee. It's heavily lopsided, 12 Democrats to 3 Republicans. And so some of I'm not trying to be political here whatsoever, so please don't take what I say in that vein. But those who are more pro-business than others, I'll put it that way, are somewhat disadvantaged in a heavily lopsided Commerce and Labor Committee, which is the committee that considers so many bills that affect the construction industry and business issues generally. The same is true on the Finance and Appropriations Committee in the Senate. That's the Budget Writing Committee. The budget drives everything, as I said, and you can see that's pretty lopsided as well. The House operates differently than the Senate. The House does proportional representation on committees. So since there are 55 to 45 Democrats and Republicans in the House, they do a like representation proportionally on all committees. But still, that's a pretty hefty advantage for one party over the other. Next slide. I'll also say that, go back one slide, Gordon. In the Senate, historically, we have always relied on the Senate to be kind of the moderating body to some populist legislation that gets out of the House. The Senate has a goodly number of pro-business Democrats. And we considered going into this session, we thought that the Senate, and they were to some extent, but we thought that the Senate would be a much bigger and better backstop to what I'll call some anti-business bills than they were. In fact, some of the pro-business Democrats introduced some of the worst business bills. And so that took us a bit by surprise, and we had to adjust. Next slide, Gordon. So now we're going to get into some of the big issues that were passed, and I'll go through these pretty quickly. There's several slides on these. It was a big year for transportation. There's going to be a gas tax increase, 5 cents this year, 5 cents next year in terms of the state gas tax. Additionally, in many parts of the state, there's also going to be a regional fuels tax, 7.6 cents a gallon. And that will happen in areas other than Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, and the I-81 corridor, because those three areas already have this. They already have the 7.6 cents a gallon regional fuel tax. And those regional fuels taxes go to help fund regional transportation projects. So you may not like a gas tax increase, but on the flip side, it's going to open up a lot of new money going into road and bridge building and to rail. So there's a lot of construction work that this will help fuel. On the minimum wage, you can see here a lot of localities and a lot of states across the country coming off of the 2019 political campaigns. We're going to drive to $15 an hour. It was generally assumed that's where we were going because that's what everybody who campaigned on it campaigned on, $15 an hour. They actually took a moderate step. Over the next 3 years, they're only going to get up to $12 an hour. Then they're going to stop and pause and look and study at how the minimum wage increase is affecting different markets. It may affect south side of Southwest Virginia in ways that different ways that it affects Northern Virginia. And this is something your legislative committee talked about and argued as a potential option. So they took a little bit of a moderate approach to the minimum wage increase. They're going to kind of ease into it and study it. Depending on that 2023 study, the regional market study, they may then go ahead and proceed toward $15 an hour by 2026, or they could call an audible and adjust going forward. But for your purposes, count on $12 an hour by 2023. We were mindful of this, but we didn't. Most contractors are paying $15 and up an hour anyway. So while we were mindful of it, we didn't wade hip deep in this issue. For many years, local governments, counties have been moaning that they don't have equal taxing authority to cities. If a town or a city wants to do a particular tax increase, they can do so by a mere vote of their governing body, city council or town council. For a county to do certain tax increases, they actually have to put it out to vote a referendum. So counties have been complaining about this for decades. This year they changed it. And they have more equal taxing authority now than with towns and cities. Next slide. Gun control, I won't get into this, but background checks, 1 handgun a month law was reintroduced. Local governments were getting more power to ban guns in public places, so gun control was a big issue. Also, casinos and sports betting. This started last year. Virginia has never been a big gambling or casino state. We did not have casinos. Now, legislation was passed to allow casinos to be potentially built in these areas: Richmond, Portsmouth, Norfolk, Danville, and Bristol. First, those localities will have to have a voter referendum to see if they want it or not. If they do, keep an eye on this, because these will be hundreds of millions of dollars in new construction for these casinos. Additionally, legalized sports betting. You can now bet on the Redskins and the Toronto Blue Jays or whomever else. You can also bet on Kentucky Wildcats basketball, but you're not allowed to bet on the Wahoos or the Hokies, so you can't bet on Virginia colleges. Marijuana decriminalization. It's no longer, it's decriminalization, not legalization. There's a difference. So now it's a civil penalty for less than an ounce. It's no jail time, and it's no longer a criminal violation. We were obviously concerned about this because of our the importance you place on work site safety. You don't want your workers coming in stoned. So we obviously kept a close eye on this, but that's the bill that passed. Next slide. The redistricting, gerrymandering, there's a constitutional amendment coming up that sets up a bipartisan redistricting commission. And to the extent the 16-person Republican and Democrat evenly split commission can't decide, the Supreme Court breaks the tie. Collective bargaining, we'll talk about more, but it's permissive. It's for local governments only. It's not for state governments. Paid sick leave. This bill came very close to passing. It failed in the 11th hour and 58th minute because on the Senate floor, there was questions about, was there sufficient money in the budget to cover state employee paid sick leave? This will be back, especially in COVID-19 era. It will likely be passed next year. It would require employers with more than 15 people to provide 1 hour of sick leave for every 30 hours worked, and it's capped at 40 hours a year. As you know, there was an effort to repeal Virginia's right to work law. It failed. I wouldn't be surprised if it comes back next year, but the state chamber has taken a lead on that. We obviously opposed it as well, opposed the elimination. Next slide. Energy was a big issue this year. The Virginia Clean Economy Act passed. It was a 75-page bill. But the bottom line is two bottom lines. One is Virginia's electricity grid will be carbon-free, meaning nuclear, wind, offshore and onshore wind, and solar principally by 2045. No more fossil fuel produced energy. The second issue was ratepayer protections. We were all very concerned about how this might impact Dominion and Appalachian Power and co-ops energy rates. And so there were lots of ratepayer protections built in. The State Corporation Commission has much greater oversight than they previously did. This bill almost didn't pass, but for added ratepayer protections and SCC oversight. So we will keep an eye on that. Next slide, Gordon. Now we're getting into the budget area. This slide is the only one on what Governor Northam proposed. So in December, he released his proposed budget, and you can see that he wanted to boost Virginia's rainy day fund, focus on secondary education, more than $1 billion of new money he proposed going into K-12, financial aid, healthcare, workforce development, a lot of money in natural resources, environment, broadband access. Those were the governor's priorities. Next slide. The next couple of slides will actually talk about what the General Assembly did with the governor's proposed budget. So when the General Assembly adjourned their very last day, they adopted the budget on March 12th. It's a balanced budget. Governor Northam had proposed boosting the reserve, the rainy day fund, to $1.9 billion. The legislature took it up even higher to $2.1 billion. So that's the most cash reserves that we've ever had. State employees are getting a salary increase, a bonus this year and a salary increase next year. Teachers are getting 4% over the next 2 years. And then drawing your attention to this, contractors, is going to be $185 million of state money going into school construction and school modernization. So be on the lookout for those K-12 RFPs that will be going out. Next slide. Still on still on the budget and what the General Assembly did in terms of capital outlay, you'll see that there's going to be almost $1 billion in bonds for new university and other state agency projects. Other state agencies being like mental health facilities. So a lot of construction coming down the pike on that. Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, $50 million to those of you who do stormwater work. That's a dollar for dollar match. So the local government has to put up $1 as well. So that's actually $100 million in stormwater work coming down the pike. That will be let by localities and public service authorities, not by the state. So be on the lookout for those RFPs. We talked about transportation and the new gas tax increase and other monies. There's going to be a new $1 billion over the next 2 years going to transportation agencies for highway maintenance, construction, passenger rail, and other road maintenance. So those of you who do some transportation work or spinoff work, could be vertical work coming from transportation projects, be on the lookout for that. A lot of new money in transportation coming. Next slide. Higher education, workforce development is one of AGC's biggest issues, as we know. Almost $80 million going to the community college to help on workforce initiatives. And we can do perhaps a separate deep dive on workforce issues. There's more money going to student financial aid to those of you who have kids in school. You know what tuition bills are doing. And then there's $75 million, $80 million over the next 2 years to encourage public institutions to hold tuition to what it is now. More work to be done on commerce and trade and attracting new investments to Virginia from other companies and helping existing companies expand. Next slide. I mentioned some money going into natural resources, wastewater treatment plants. There's going to be $50 million worth of construction going into wastewater treatment plants. There also will be a local match for that. It's not necessarily a dollar for dollar, but it's kind of this project is specific. So there's probably going to be somewhere between $50 and $100 million in wastewater treatment plant work over the next year or two. It's going to be $100 million, as I mentioned, with the local match for stormwater. $33 million for new state parks. That's going to include new cabins and other utility work to be done. Alexandria, they've got a $450 or $500 million CSO project they're doing. Now we're going to get into, we're drilling down. Yeah, next slide, Gordon. Now we're going to get into your specific bills, and I'll ask Gordon to chime in on some of these. As we know, statute of limitations has been your priority, therefore our priority for the last 2 or 3 years. We've been frustrated. This year, we've reported back to you occasionally that we thought this year was the year to do it. So I'll ask, so we went from infinity in terms of what your liability is, in terms of latent defects and the state being able to come back on you, down to 15 years. That's the best we could do. We worked in conjunction with others. But I'll turn over to Gordon in a second. Let me just hit 2 others. The right to work, I've already mentioned. The proposed bill to eliminate right to work failed. What did pass was collective bargaining, but it's only for local governments and it's permissive. So a local government would actually have to pass an ordinance allowing for collective bargaining, but that's something that we opposed. But again, given the philosophical and political shifts in the legislature and some of the lopsided nature of the relevant committees, it passed with somewhat relative ease, to be honest about it. Let me ask Gordon to weigh in on the 2 big issues that we work so closely with you on, and that is statute of limitations and the project labor agreements.
Thank you, Preston. Really appreciate the summary at this point. So as you all know, in the statute of limitations, this is something that we stayed very laser focused on, not just during session, but well in advance of that. As you all know, we've been working with DGS, and I think one of the things that has been instrumental is that we have constantly kept our lines of communication open with DGS and Joe D'Amico and his team on this issue. From last year's session on, we were writing letters and having conversations and trying to assist them in figuring out how to solve this. And one of the issues that DGS had on this was, how do we determine what's the right number and what's the actual fiscal or financial impacts going to be, not just on contractors, but also on state agencies and those types of components. So they didn't really know how big of a problem it truly was. And so as DGS went along, they sent a survey out. Many of you responded to that. That was instrumental. What that led DGS to understand is that a lot of contractors, general and subcontractors, did not realize that they were liable for eternity on these contracts. So as we went along, our survey pointed that out to them. They then held a open session with various different constituency groups, not just us, but also engineers and architects. And we actually went out and spoke with the architects and engineers and said, hey, this is the year to jump on board and get on this, because it's going to impact you all as well. And that helped us garner a larger coalition. We included that with the Virginia Transportation Construction Alliance and others to make sure they were included as well. So it included all contractors. During that summer session, we talked a lot about what happened on this, what the impacts were going to be. And DGS started to see that, yes, there was an issue, but where's the right number? Fortunately, DGS continued to have that relationship. And as we went along, we knew we probably had the numbers to get it to pass again in the Senate. We weren't quite sure whether we had the numbers to get it to pass in the House Appropriations Committee, let alone to get the governor's approval on that. So there were several different hurdles in this and lots of different people who had to get involved in this. Anytime you get legislation like this to move forward, there are going to be people who aren't going to be happy with everything. And I get that. And I get that the 15 years is out there and it's a big mark, but at least for insurance and bonding purposes, we've got a number out there so that hopefully that can move forward as we go along. We'll need to continue to monitor this going forward. This issue's not done yet. We'll work with DGS and continue to hear about issues and concerns that are out there to make sure that we get the right number, whatever that may be. I want to also caution anyone, just to make sure we understand that there's an understood rule within the legislature that if you pass a bill and everyone agrees on something, you leave it alone for a while. You let it sit. You don't come back the next year and try and tweak it again unless there's something super egregious on that. So I want to make sure that we understand that while there may be a desire to lower that number from 15 years to what might be a more reasonable number, that's a key component. Another part of this that I want to make sure that we understand is that while it does limit the statute of limitations to 15 years, it also allows for 5 years of latent defects after discovery. So that was a big portion that we put in there as well. So if there is a defect out there, no public agency can quote unquote sit on it. Not that they're going to sit on it, but they have to let the contractor and subcontractor know about the potential latent defect as soon as they discover it. And so we worked a lot with them, and I think that this is gonna help everyone move forward to kind of understand what happens on this. I do want to thank several folks who helped us get to where we are. Not just everyone on the legislative committee, but there were several people in the legislative committee who really helped out and stepped out and looked into the details and got really granular on this. Jim Harvey, Spencer Wiegard, Webb Moore, there were several attorneys. We had some bonding folks, Kerry Wurzel, Scott Rooney, and others really helped us kind of look at this and kind of figure out where it needed to go on that. So this is a significant victory for us. In light of the fact that we didn't really have anything to offer the other side on this. And when you don't have anything to offer the other side in exchange, it can be very difficult to get some type of legislation through one way or the other. So I want to make sure that you guys understand the significance of this at this point. The other issue, the project labor agreements, Another issue that is very significant, this bill went through all kinds of iterations as it went through the General Assembly. At one point, we got it negated such that it pretty much reverted back to the previous legislation or the current legislation that says it's neither prohibited nor encouraged. Then it came back from the House and went back to its original version and then opened it up to all public works. So this includes localities may choose to do this, state agencies may choose to do this, universities may choose to do this, the Port Authority may choose to go this route if it wanted to. So we'll wait and see where it goes. The issue on this is that this issue is not over yet. In fact, our legislative committee just met 2 weeks ago on this very issue because the governor has not yet signed this bill. And so we are going to make one last-ditch effort to try to encourage the governor to either A, veto the bill, or at the very least, amend the bill to establish a threshold. We'd love to see a $200 million threshold on this so that no public work project below 200 million could be utilized through a project labor agreement. As you all well know, 97% of all contractors in Virginia are not labor. And as a result, there would be very few people, if a project labor agreement were to go through, very few Virginians would be able to work on the project other than the general contractor, because it would go through the union halls, and the union halls would determine who among their network is going to go and do the project. And if you're not a union member, then you're not probably working on the project. So it's pretty egregious. So we are going to be working on a public marketing campaign. You all are going to see some action alerts from us to encourage the governor to veto and or amend this bill. We're going to communicate to likely legislators who might realize that this issue is not a good bill to go forward due to the increased cost and expense that's going to happen on all public projects moving forward. So we've got a little bit of opportunity yet. The backstop on this also is that if this bill does pass, the final component is it's got to go to the localities. And then it's going to be kind of a street fight by street fight to try and stop this if we can, and to make sure that whichever locality goes in at this is going to have a little bit more of a difficult time, or at least have some pushback to move it forward. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to add one other thing real quick before I turn it back over to Preston. If you all have questions, and some of you have already done this, and I appreciate that, if you toggle your mouse down at the bottom, there should be a Q&A question that you can click Q&A, and you can type your question in, and we'll answer those questions here once we come to the end of our discussion or our presentation. Preston, I'm going to turn it back over to you at this point.
Thank you, Gordon. Very good. Next slide. Prevailing wage passed. This is for Davis-Bacon wages. At the state level, it's required for public works projects more than $250,000 in value. At the local level of government, it's allowed, it's permissive for projects that are over $250,000 in value. There are two bills, and I'll say more about these on a subsequent slide. There was a best value contracting bill, as there frequently is. This particular bill, this one was better than some others, but it was agreed to be carried over. There's a separate bill requiring contractors to pay their subcontractors within 7 days of the GC getting his or her payment. That bill had some obvious issues with it. That's been carried over as well. I'll say a little bit more about that. Non-payment of wages. There was legislation passed that creates, and we almost reflexively oppose anything that creates a cause of action against an employer. Just as a matter of gospel, we oppose those. This bill has been introduced for many years running. It finally passed this year, again, based on the changing political and philosophical dynamics. But it creates a private cause of action for you if you fail to pay. Comes with interest, and depending on the severity, can be up to triple wages. Next slide. Mechanics lien, right to withhold. That bill passed. You can see there's still, if you got beefs with your sub on the quality of labor, or if there are beefs with the sub still on the provision of materials, those are reasons to still withhold payment, but yet another private cause of action. The definition of small business, you can see this bill has been introduced for many years. It was carried over this year as well. Frankly, this affects different AGC members differently. So we monitored this, but we did not take a position on it. Next slide. Construction management, a lot of you do CM work. This bill basically codified that which the governor's office can do pretty much on their own, it seems. But state and local governments can now only use CM and design build contracts for $26 million and up. Anything below that, it's more CM bid, design bid build. Small purchases, again, this is for things other than for professional services, increases from 100K to 200,000. Small purchases exemption for single or term contracts. That may affect some of you, it may not. Next slide. I mentioned two bills that we have homework assignment on, and we'll be calling on some of you on the legislative committee or beyond the legislative committee to help. So Senate Bill 475, Senator Bell of Loudoun County, he is a procurement expert. That's what he does as a civilian employee for the Air Force. He does procurement. He is really good. He's very collegial and cordial. He's great to work with. He had one of the best value contracting bills. He very much wants this bill, but he also very much understood our concerns about it. He agreed to kick it down the road until next year on the condition that we work with him over the summer to try to come up with an agreeable approach. So we agreed to do that. So we will be calling on one or two or more of you to help with that. The second bill, Senator Vogel of Fauquier County introduced the bill that would require a contractor to pay a sub within 7 days of the GC being paid on a state or local project. This was not something that the Subcontractors Association came up with. This is a subcontractor in Senator Vogel's district came to her about this, and she agreed to put in the bill. So it didn't come from any organized group. My partner, Chris Nolan, did a lot of work with Senator Vogel along with Gordon to get her to carry this over till next year. But again, it was with the agreement that we try to come to a resolution, a mutually agreeable resolution over the summer. Next slide, Gordon. So a couple of budget items to be mindful of. We mentioned the governor's G3 community college program. This is for the skilled trades. This is for, it started out as a so-called free community college. It's not quite that, but it's for skilled trades and other high demand fields, but targeted for low and middle income students. So this plays into one of our issues. Economic development, on the Business Ready Site program, that's it's just, I should have said it's just shy of construction. It's really land acquisition and getting through environmental permitting so that you can then begin grading and putting up shell buildings or other buildings. So that's something we'll keep our eye on for your work. We've talked about the utility work in terms of wastewater treatment plants and stormwater projects, probably $100 million going forward in each of those. Next slide, Gordon. And there's continued focus on small business and SWAM procurement. There are a couple of items in the budget that will continue propelling that. That impacts some of you more than others, but it's something that we pay attention to on your behalf and try to keep you abreast of it. Next slide, Gordon. A few other items just to bring to your attention for business development purposes. There's almost $1 billion, and these are just a few projects that'll be let going forward by universities and museums. You can see Norfolk State's going to build a new science building. Radford's got a building, or Virginia State. A number of community college projects. University of Virginia and VMI are going to have projects going on. So these are just a few. There are more than this, but these are some of the signature projects. But it's almost $1 billion worth of construction coming down the pike just on this. So keep your eye out for that. And then the next slide. I'll turn it back over to Gordon, but this is where we're going to go in the next, again, I mentioned that the General Assembly comes back on April 22nd. So again, project labor agreement legislation is one of our key focus areas to try to get him to veto that. I don't think he will, but he might amend it. But we're, trying to get him to veto it. So Gordon, I'll turn it back over to you, but this is where we'll be working for the next spring, summer, and fall.
Preston, thank you very much for those comments. As Preston said, a rather intense year to say the least. In the 25 years or so that I've been working in the legislature, I will tell you, I've never seen a schedule as hectic as it was due to the volume, a little bit of new leadership and kind of figuring out who's on first and what's on second. And as a result, it was very difficult to get to legislators to talk to them about issues. And I think that's a key component, is that if you can't get your message to legislators in time, they may not know what's going on out there. And so I think it's crucially important as we move forward that we continue to build our relationships with legislators, that you specifically build your relationships with your local legislators, whether you agree with them philosophically or not. As a business owner, they're going to want to hear what you do. They want to hear, your concerns. They want to hear how it impacts what you do. A couple things legislators don't realize is not only the amount of pay, the level of pay that you all provide your employees, but also the benefits that you provide your employees. The perception for a lot of these legislators is that you are paying minimum wage or near minimum wage for all of your employees. And we all know that's not the case. So that's a key component that we've got to continue to convey to legislators as we move along and address these issues. We are going to be monitoring several different components moving forward, whether it's various different workforce development initiatives, or assisting with talking with General Assembly members, whether it's Senator Vogel in the Valley on her prompt payment bill, or it's Senator Bell dealing with his issue on procurement methods. I think that's going to continue to evolve. We're going to have to continue to talk with DGS and make sure they understand all of our issues, but also other localities to make sure they hear our issues going forward. I'm going to check to see what kind of questions we have at this point. Just a reminder, there's a component down at the bottom, a Q&A button. Just hit that and hit questions on there, and we'll see if we have any at this point. So hold on one second. So one of the questions on House Bill 123, and I hate that bill. I hate that bill with a passion, not because of this is the wage theft bill. And the question is, thoughts on how non-payment by lower tier subs will impact GCs? What kinds of things generally do GCs need to think about to mitigate their risks, contractual indemnity, bonding by downstream subs, etc.? And Alex, it's a great question. So recapping real quick, House Bill 123 is the bill that says that general contractors have to pay subcontractors wages if the subcontractor doesn't pay their wages. Or knowingly knows that they don't pay their wages. So these are some great thoughts that you ask. I was if any of you all were on the AGC National webinar yesterday, they were talking about this issue specifically as COVID-19 comes in, and if it takes some of the smaller subcontractors under during this process, GCs need to be aware that they may be liable in other states now. It's not in Virginia just yet, but it's key components on how to think about this. This is going to impact all lower tier or upper tier contractors moving forward. We're hopeful that maybe the governor might amend this bill as well, knowing the current environment. One of the things, and it brings up State Senator Chap Peterson last week sent a letter to the governor asking him to specifically look through every piece of legislation that passed through the lens of how it's going to impact small business owners going forward. Senator Peterson is a trial lawyer in Northern Virginia, Democrat, but has a soft spot for all small business owners. And not that Democrats don't, but he does have a soft spot for small business contractors in there. And so that's a key component that needs to be addressed. So Preston, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that at this point.
I don't have anything else to add. We'll see what the governor does with the bill. And I would think that might be something that we could do a webinar on specifically once we see the final disposition of the bill and how it shakes out if the governor amends it. Maybe it's also a workshop item for an upcoming AGC conference. That and some others, but yeah, I mean, that's an issue.
That's great. That also kind of reminds me, one of the things that we've also heard from some Democrats at this point regarding COVID-19, not Democrats, but just legislators, is that they are talking to the governor, trying to get him to consider holding a special session to figure out how the Commonwealth is going to deal with the impacts of COVID-19. Current budget estimates are that the state's going to lose or going to cost the state at least $1 billion. It's an early estimate. And so they may try and figure out what they can do and try and help save those small businesses moving forward. We'll see where that goes moving forward from here. I do have, let's see, a couple more questions here. How could the proposed governor budget change based on new public health care needs? It's a good question. Preston, thoughts on that?
Yeah, my thoughts would be speculative. So the legislature will come back into session on April 22nd to take up amendments and vetoes. And the budget is also a bill that the governor can, I mean, the budget is a bill. The budget is a piece of legislation, so that it also can be amended. With the Secretary of Finance, Aubrey Lien, said last week that with the COVID-19 and the economic slowdown, that Virginia's revenues may take a $1 billion hit. That's significant. Of course, when you build a budget, just like in your business, you base it on what you project your revenues for the year to be. So I would expect that the revenues projections will now have to be downwardly adjusted. That could impact, you know, again, I'm speculating here, so don't take this to the bank, so to speak, by any means. But if they, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, perhaps in April, when they're already here on April 22nd, that they also have a special session where they would take up COVID-19 and economic related issues, revise the budget, downwardly adjust the revenue projections. If you downwardly adjust the projections, you're obviously going to have to cut your expenses. Where would they cut expenses? Well, on the one hand, you know, capital infrastructure could be a place to do it. On the other hand, construction industry is what builds and maintains public infrastructure, and interest rates are very low. So now, you know, you can make an argument that now is not the time to be cutting back on capital investments. But we'll see. I mean, anything I could say beyond that would be even more speculation. But they could shift some. And they've got money built in there for various salary increases. Would they delay that? I don't know. In order to preserve cash. Again, I'm totally speculating, but you've got to look at where the big buckets of cash are in the budget, and they're usually in the higher ed space, the capital outlay space, and in the public employee compensation space. Those are usually where the big buckets of money are, and in healthcare. So they could cut in some areas and shift over to healthcare if they find they have to.
Great. Another question, Preston, I appreciate that. One more question at this point. And it says, does AGC have relationships with the Virginia Economic Development Authority, the Virginia Association of Commercial Real Estate, and Hampton Roads Area Commercial Real Estate General Assembly consultants? Are there issues that these three groups and or other groups can work on together? Preston, before you answer, I'll say, yeah, we do have relationships with all of those folks, and we work with those lobbyists on various different issues, whether it was the wage theft issues. We all kind of coalesced around those. We tried to coalesce and push back on right to work and fair share issues. So there are some issues on that. We are talking with those, Economic Developers Association to get them to see where we are on that as we move forward. But it's something we probably, and that's one of the things that we have been working on, quite frankly, is working on different coalitions, trying to get other people involved in there. I think of the quote, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." And so when you see legislation, you look at it and say, okay, who is this going to hurt the most if I don't like it? And let's go talk to those guys and let's see how we can kind of band together and work on various different issues. So as you hear the quote all the time, politics make strange bedfellows. This year, no doubt about that. No doubt about that. We worked with lots of different coalitions on that. Preston, anything you want to add on that?
I'll just say quickly that McGuire Woods, we work with VEDP all of the time, almost on a daily basis, representing various clients who are doing project expansions. My partner, Chris Lloyd, is the legislative counsel to the Virginia Economic Developers Association, which also works very close with VEDP, obviously. And then Gordon and I work with the Hampton Roads, Acre, and others. Phil Abraham represents them, and so we work very closely with Phil on any number of issues. And so, yes, there are those connections.
One more question came in. After the governor either signs or vetoes these bills, when can we expect to see some of these budget items released?
So the legislation and the budget, unless otherwise noted, goes into effect July 1, 2020. So the budget will go to effect July 1, 2020. But on a lot of these capital projects, anticipating the money being there, nobody expects these to fall out, but folks are already positioning themselves now to pursue these projects, but the money will start being released to start a new fiscal year on July 1.
All right. Those are all the questions we have. Guys, we're going to wrap it up. I thank you very much, Preston. Thank you. Thank you for your team, Chris Nolan and Margaret Rockwell, for all the work that they did the last several months and even leading into it, getting us as prepared as we could be. I really appreciate our legislative committee getting involved. If you have interest in being involved in our legislative committee going forward, we're always looking for new ideas and thoughts. Please reach out to me directly, and we'll get you included on that. And after that, I hope you guys have a safe week, and let me know how you guys are doing out there. Thank you very much. Preston, our screen share has stopped. We should be good.
Okay, will you do me a favor?
Yes, sir.
Go back on your PowerPoint, and I got my zip code wrong on the last slide. It should be 23219, not 23210. 23219. So you'll change that.
Yeah.
23219.
Done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Brother.
Appreciate it.
Bye.